welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. I know you have a lot of interest, Dominik, in NFTs, and it was interesting for me to see last year just how NFTs went so mainstream, just being in the blockchain crypto space for some years. I think it was in 2017, there was a lot of hype, but I guess there was a lot of hype within the crypto communities about projects such as crypto cats, where you could breed these cats and they would create this process of breeding would create unique cats, and then it was based on this new kind of ERC 721 on Ethereum, and it was quite interesting, and the whole properties of non-fungibility versus fungibility. So it was interesting at the time, and then kind of stayed there. There was still some projects going on in the space, but I feel like over the past year or so, like clearly it's just exploded. And I like a post that you guys through Walt ID put on Twitter, kind of just creating a diagram of industries and companies that use NFTs. And it's crazy to see, like companies like Disney and Spotify and entertainment, companies like MasterCard, Visa, Shopify and payments, consumer good companies like Adidas and Nike. Like it's absolutely crazy just how this has gone mainstream and just really outside of the crypto community. So what do you think drove this hype cycle for NFTs in 2021 and today? And maybe what excites you about non-fungible tokens?
Yeah, you're completely right. It's insane how quickly that whole topic of NFTs exploded. So, I mean, what drove this? I mean, if you look at new technologies, then very often it's the social applications that are really helping new technologies to go mainstream, or let's say to get broader adoption. And I think, that's what happens with Bored Ape Yacht Club and CryptoPunks and digitizing art, and then being able to trade it and to sell it and to have this as some kind of, I don't know, a thing that you keep, and it binds you to a certain community, and then you're part of it, and you can showcase it wherever you want to, use it as avatars and icons on your social media pages and wherever. So I guess it was the social component was definitely one thing that helped NFTs to grow bigger. The other thing is definitely, very good marketing on Twitter. If you think about the number of people who were actually holding NFTs, especially early on, and how much buzz was created around this, also with this high sales volumes. So that was definitely a very well engineered tactic around NFTs. And then the last, maybe a third thing that was very important about this, and this is also something that is a big problem with decentralized self-sovereign identity today, is that if you are a creator of NFTs, so someone who issues them, you're actually incentivized to do it because you can sell them, you can make a living of it. Whereas if we look at the stuff that's happening with self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity, where you need an authentic data source to give away identity information, they're not really incentivized to do that. And I think that's also one of the reasons why NFTs also in the used for identity use cases in Web3 were, let's say, top of the list very quickly, and maybe even to a certain extent were used instead of concepts that are much better suited for identity, like verifiable credentials. But then to answer your question of why it fascinates me, I mean, at the end of the day, I believe in two things. I believe that on the one hand, all our identity information will be digitized and controlled in wallets. And then I also believe that all types of assets will be tokenized and controlled via wallets. And so that's basically SSI and NFTs, right? So NFTs for me, it's just a way of tokenizing assets in a way that, and that could be anything, physical, digital things up to IP, tokenizing assets in order to just make them very easy to trade and to control and to digitally model property. And then you can do many amazing things with those things.
Yeah, your comment about the incentives is a very interesting one. The incentive, and I think that's on the SSI side of thing. That's where you see people talk about the chicken and egg problem, and it's where
Exactly.
the value in the exchange of credentials happens at the exchange between the holder and the verifier, because that's where the business value gets created. But to create that supply of credentials, there's a lack of incentives for, at least in the regulatory space or the so-called real world space that we live in today, for existing source data owners to digitize or issue them in these specific formats that could be used as people wish. That's quite interesting. And I think the whole idea of people on Twitter using NFTs as avatars, and this whole pseudonymous movement as well, where there's people with like millions of followers, but their identity, let's say, is not tied to their government issued identity. It's just tied to some pseudonymous identity. But I guess, would you say that this whole NFT movement, like, it clearly has gotten people thinking more about identity, which I would say perhaps is a good thing for the people in the SSI space?
Yeah, sure. I mean, definitely. It's so fun to watch this, because if you look at all these new technologies popping up, the people who are building this, most of the people really love technology, and you see all this different currents of people with their very strong opinions. So you have lots of maximalists, right? Bitcoin is good, Ethereum is good, other blockchains are good. And then we see the same thing happening with NFTs and identity. So I remember when, we started to work on our NFT products. As you know, we started out with SSI products, so identity, core identity, if you will. And then we started to work on our NFT products a couple of months back last year. And we internally talked a lot about, what would happen, what would be the backlash in the whole SSI community if we're doing this. And then, I mean, people understood why we did it, for example. But at the end of the day, very quickly, you hear people being very dismissive from the identity space about using NFTs for identity. And then also the other way around, and people coming from the NFT side saying, well, SSI doesn't work, it's so complex. Why would you use it? You can do it with NFTs already, and everybody has them, and they work with our existing wallet infrastructure and so on. But I think, it's much more nuanced. The world isn't black or white, it's very often gray. And so what I always try to explain to people is that SSI and NFTs are two completely distinct creatures, just like identity and basically assets, or let's say property rights. Those are very different things. The one describes who I am, the other describes what I own. And so that does not, even though those are different things, that doesn't mean that I cannot use NFTs for access management, for example, right? I could access a service or a physical event site maybe by showing my actual identity. But at the end of the day, if you think about tickets, typically it's just enough to show that you own something to get in. And so why not use digital assets, tokenized assets, aka NFTs, to do access management, which typically was, an area that was reserved to identity people. And so I think people are starting to understand this. And at the end of the day, it's just two different things with which you can implement very different sets of use cases, depending on, whatever your requirements are. And I think that's exciting.
The concept of access management using NFTs, or as you describe it, the ownership-based access management is quite interesting. I think people sometimes that, I guess, and I totally agree with your point that nothing's ever black and white. And I think people in general just have trouble not thinking that way. I think often people are on one side and the other, and you talk about maximalism in crypto or maximalism in NFTs, and I think there's probably a certain degree of maximalism that exists just in the SSI space as well.
Sure.
I think with NFTs, the one thing I see is, I think just the concept of transferability of assets, which is possible, which kind of eliminates a lot of identity use cases. But I think people also forget that, like, addresses and private keys are transferable as well, right? You don't necessarily need to. Your private key is not necessarily your identity, because that is transferable as well. So I think on two levels, the asset itself is transferable, but your wallet or your private keys are transferable as well, which when I was looking into, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the concept of soul-bound tokens, because it's been interesting to see now.
Oh yeah.
And there's a lot of talk about, and it's exciting to now see talk about verifiable credentials and DIDs inside of the crypto or Web3 community. But this whole concept of soul-bound tokens that came about recently, maybe you could explain to the listeners who aren't familiar with it what those are, and kind of what you think overall about it.
So soul-bound tokens, quite recently, Vitalik Buterin, the co-creator of Ethereum, wrote a paper on this, although the concept is a bit older. And then also recently on the Bankless podcast, there was an episode with Vitalik and Evan McMahon, who is great. And she's really holding up the SSI flag in the Web3 community, and is doing a great work of educating people about the differences between NFTs and SSI. And so I think, if you want to get very deep into this topic, I definitely recommend listening to this podcast, because they dive into many different areas of this. But at the core of it, the idea is that while NFTs, non-fungible tokens, are typically something that is tradable. So the idea is you tokenize an asset and then you can sell it, you can trade it. You could also do NFTs in a way by which they are bound to a specific wallet, for example. And that could be interesting for use cases where you don't want an NFT to be traded. So let's say Vitalik gives this example of a game that he used to play, and then if you're doing a lot of the hard work, you get certain skins, and then the designer of the games, they did not want you to be able to trade this, because it shouldn't be easy. You shouldn't be able to cut corners. It should be very hard to get those skins with those special benefits that come with them. And then in a similar way, you can design NFTs to be bound to a wallet. And then, well, if you can do this, then we're quite close to what SSI is doing, in a sense that verifiable credentials are issued to a certain DID or wallet address or whatever. So they're also issued to a very specific recipient and are not meant to be traded. And then the question becomes, if you can do NFTs that are soul-bound, why not use soul-bound tokens instead of verifiable credentials? And I think there are, again, many different areas that you could think about of why it's good or why it's bad. What are the advantages and disadvantages? I think at the end of the day, it really boils down to a couple of core issues that you have. One core issue, should I talk about them briefly?
Yeah, okay, I would love to hear some more.
So I think one core issue, and you're not, but I'm based in Europe. And so in Europe, we have the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, which most probably heard of. And so the problem you have is, if you have a wallet address or a public key, let's say a public key that's linked to identity information, and that's treated as pseudonymous data, and the pseudonymous data is protected under GDPR. And so then if it's protected under GDPR, it's basically personal data. And then that means that you have the right to erasure, so the right to be forgotten, right? So I need to be able to cancel that out, which of course doesn't work with blockchains. So I have the right to not have my data being automatically processed or sent over like outside the European Union or over the borders of different countries, which obviously happens if you use a public permissionless ledger where nodes are all over the place. And so you just run into lots of compliance issues, which means that you, at least in Europe or for European citizens, you can't really use NFTs for identity use cases for natural persons, right? For legal entities, it's a different thing. We're just talking about people's data. But then, that's just the compliance side. But then you could say, okay, maybe regulations change or amended, and maybe I only have business in Asia or whichever place where there may not be that strict privacy regulations. But then you still have certain privacy issues that come with it. So for example, obviously, you can always see which address transfers which assets to which other address. And then, if everyone can see this, then just from knowing who controls a certain wallet address, or maybe which organizations, people's entities, whoever control those addresses, you can see the flows of different assets. And so from these assets, you can infer some information. So you have inherently, like, even if the metadata is encrypted, or if it's stored off-chain, or whatever type of technique you use, you potentially have certain privacy issues just looming, just looming over you. And also, as you know, like, you cannot really prevent people from sending your NFTs to wallet addresses also. And so that's, I think, a very, very important privacy aspect to it. And then next, you're probably running into, this is point number 3, cost issues, and related to this also scalability issues, right? But then again, you could say, okay, well, I could use certain blockchains where scalability is high, where costs are low. There are layer 2s that are being created so that you can even use, let's say, more secure decentralized networks like Ethereum by just using layer 2s on top. But I think those points at the core are just 4 things or 4 good reasons for using SSI, at least for natural persons, as opposed to NFTs. But again, that doesn't mean that you cannot use NFTs for access management, right? Where there's no connection, where you don't want to have a connection between an entity and access rights, or maybe using them for, identity of things, or legal entities. In case of legal entities, it could be a good thing that all your information is stored on the blockchain and publicly available to everyone. Maybe you want this.
Yeah, I think the data privacy, and especially you kind of alluded to it a little bit, like there's no consent in this NFT model, right? Like anyone could just send you anything to your address, like anything whatsoever. And this information will be made visible without your consent, basically. So I don't, for a lot of use cases, I just don't see how that even works. The other thing as well is people tend to mix up decentralized, the concept of decentralization, where like in a network like Ethereum, for example, like the governance and the maintenance of the network is decentralized, but the network is a centralized network. So if you're creating stuff on this network, it's not portable, or it's not interoperable with other networks that are out there. Whereas with the standards that we use in self-sovereign identity, you're not bound whatsoever to a network. And a lot of the work of standardization over the past years has been to kind of separate those layers so that you could really operate outside of the boundary of a specific network.
That's completely true. But that's, at the end of the day, also one of the big issues with SSI. It's just very complex. It's very difficult to build it. It's very difficult to build an identity wallet. Like, you just need so much more stuff than, if you want to launch NFT product. I mean, NFTs work today. They work with our existing Web3 wallet infrastructure, whereas doing SSI the way it's supposed to be, it doesn't work with our existing wallet infrastructure. So you need new types of wallets that also speak, certain protocols, like, let's say, the latest OpenID Connect extensions, for example, or DIGCOM. I mean, obviously you can go around this by using stuff like, things like those solid pods or identity hubs, where you can have data sitting somewhere and just give access tokens to people to somehow circumvent the implementation of those protocols. But it's just much more complex than using NFTs.
Yeah, and it's almost like at a certain point, you don't want to just keep investing in a self-sovereign identity wallet, because you're going to run into hurdles once standards change or once guidance changes, and you need to ensure that you're following that in order to be able to serve the purpose of a holder in any use case specifically. WaltID's wallet is one of the wallets that has been kind of shown conformant under EPSI, I think, in Europe. What does it mean to be an EPSI compliant wallet, and what did you have to do to go through that process?
I mean, maybe briefly about our wallet kit. So even though we have a web app, a progressive web app that you could use, you can also test it. All the information is on our website. You can play with it. The main idea behind the wallet kit is actually to not have a Wallet ID wallet or something like this, but to enable existing applications who are already on the market and have millions of customers to just infuse them with capabilities of handling verifiable credentials for NFTs. So that's, I think, a bit of a different approach than most or many SSI vendors have. Anyways, that being said, we went through the EPSI conformance testing. That's true. What the EPSI, by the way, stands for European Blockchain Service Infrastructure. That's like the European blockchain run by public authorities of different member states. And there's high hopes that this could be something like a permission blockchain infrastructure for enabling, high level of assurance credentials and all these kinds of things. But they actually outline this conformance test. Unfortunately, I don't know the details because I wasn't on the dev team or working on this directly. But I think all the details should be available on the website. I think they also showcase the conformance test reports, and they're changing over time because EPSI is evolving. Standards are being polished, fine-tuned, changed. Right now, for example, or recently, there was a change in the EPSI DID method to make sure that we further minimize the use of on-chain DIDs for natural persons, So I think the best way to learn about this is to go to their website and check it out. I think the number is growing of wallets that are conformant. By now it's 9 or even more wallets. And I mean, in a nutshell, or from a tech perspective, the most important thing to know is that the EPSI tech stack is building on the global standards. So EPSI is the blockchain, ESIF is the identity framework on top of EPSI. So it's the European SSI framework, ESIF. And ESIF picked up global standards from the W3C, the DIF, the OpenID Foundation, to make sure that the European SSI framework is not something that's completely different from what's happening in the industry. And so the tech stack that you would need to be EPSI compliant is basically a tech stack that can support. The EPSI blockchain is a Hyperledger Besu implementation, although they offer APIs to facilitate interactions with the blockchain. But then you need to implement the DID EPSI, so there's special DID method. I think you need 2 types of keys: SecP, because it's a Besu blockchain, and then I think also you need Edward Curve, so ED25519. And then going up the stack, I'm not sure if they're still only supporting JWT credentials or already JSON LD, but definitely JSON LD is like the goal for the future. And then they're betting on the OpenID Connect extension, so SIOP, OpenID Connect for credential issuance and presentation exchange.
Thank you. That's quite helpful. And then I would be interested to just hear a little bit more. We've been doing some work with the OpenID SIOP. And it was quite funny when I was looking on the Wallet ID website in your, I think in your kit for this, where you're taking advantage of the open policy agent, which was something we were looking at as well. And there's, I think access management is a very hot use case for digital identity, obviously, and for self-sovereign identity. There are big kind of technology providers like Microsoft, and even seeing recently a demonstration that was done at Identityverse conference showing interoperability between different wallets, like Ping Identity, I think, had a wallet, and Workday had a wallet, and they're able to show that they were able to basically request for a resource through Microsoft Azure using I guess OIDC SIOP. But the big difference, and why I was excited to see this open policy agent, is that by deploying this, you're able to remove the policy agent from this centralized source. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about what your vision is for how the self-sovereign identity standards and technologies will work alongside stuff like OIDC and kind of some of the work that you guys are doing there.
One of the reasons why we started to work with OpenID Connect, apart from the fact that it was selected by Europe as the protocol of choice for data exchange and authentication, is the fact that the number of websites that already support OpenID Connect related flows is insane. It's like over 80%. Someone else showed me that the real number, it's like 50 billion or something. So you have this really widespread adoption of protocol that's been already used everywhere. as opposed to, SSI native protocols, obviously, due to the lack of production systems, not having any traction. And so for us, it was always very interesting to see what's already there and how you could connect the old with the new world. And so for us, OpenID Connect and getting engaged with the OpenID Foundation and supporting here and being one of the first to implement all of this, also working together with Thorsten Noderstedt and others, also Oliver Terbo and so on, who are deeply involved in the standards, was I think a good choice, and it makes a lot of sense. Soon, by the way, we'll also be launching the IDP kit. It's an identity provider that will allow you to use verifiable credentials and NFTs with your existing identity and access management infrastructure. So I think last week there was an internal demo. So this already works. So we're going to publish it soon, I guess, also open source on the Apache too. And I think this is really interesting when you can start to connect the new with the old world, bridge the gap between Web3 and Web2. So this about OpenID Connect. What was the first question you were asking before?
Yeah, I was interested in what you're doing here, but also where the open policy agent fits into the stack.
The open policy agent. Yeah, so that's an interesting story, because it was not really that we planned this or we figured this out by ourselves. We had this interesting project together with other partners, which was about, building some way of doing delegation and mandates with SSI. And then, one of the organizations we work with, they said, well, and what could we use it? We need some kind of policy management configuration system, whatever. And so a partner of us, I think, at the end of the day, came up with this and showed it to us. And we are always very interested to just make it easier for people to use our tools and to build real applications with those tools. Because as you may know, we're this infrastructure company. We're not building applications. We're not building user interfaces. Our goal is to enable other companies build great products with this infrastructure. So we're really focusing on the lower level stuff. And then there's some obvious things that you could do to make your clients' lives easier if you're such an infrastructure company, which is to build tools around the stuff that's doing the heavy lifting. So for example, the SSI kit is our product that enables you to build products with SSI. And then obviously you need verifiable credentials, and then different industries and use cases have different requirements of what types of credentials they want. So we built something which we call VC-lib. And now we launched something which we call VC Generator. That just makes it very easy to, with a low-code approach, create JSON-LD credentials, then pull them into the VC-lib from where you can then use it in the SSI kit, instead of doing all of this, in a type-safe way by yourself, which takes a lot of time. It's super difficult. And then the same way, that's like the input side, right? And then the policy agent is like the output side, or the verification side. So obviously, if you're getting credentials, you want to be able to verify those credentials in an automated fashion. And you want to be able to have different, especially, customizable verification policies that serve your individual use case needs. And so, I feel that the credits go to the dev team here, the technical side of the business, and Phil, my co-founder, Xavier, and so on, who figured this out and built this. But it's pretty cool to see that the traction that open policy agent generally has, and then the abilities that you can actually, or the capabilities that come with using this open source thing that's here and alive and thriving, and that we can just use to extend the stuff that our products can do.
Yeah, I'm quite excited about that piece of the puzzle, because it just I think when you look at, like I mentioned, companies like Microsoft or that type of model where the business model is having within their platform kind of the policy management and stuff like that, being able to take that policy management outside of there just creates more openness and more interoperability. So when we talk about the concept of bring your own ID, it's really bring your own ID, not necessarily within the confined of a consortium,
Yeah.
Where do you see the big kind of advantages of using this either instead, but we're not really talking about instead because we're looking at more of an add-on to existing infrastructure. But where do you see this OpenID SIOP slash verifiable credentials really being a value add to existing systems? Like what is the business value that you see there?
Especially with regards to WebAuth and stuff that's coming along with which you can do authentication. Yeah, sure. I mean, there, obviously, as you know, there's so many different ways of authenticating someone. And I think a big one in the future will be WebAuth, and that's just an awesome way of doing it. And I think this will be big, and that has really the potential to kill passwords. And honestly, you don't need verifiable credentials to do this. So I think, doing key-based authentication is completely fine. And I think that's a great way of doing it. And so this is also definitely something of interest for us to see where this goes and how WebAuthn fits together with what we're building. But then everything beyond this, simple, okay, you've already been here, you can go in. This is what you need SSI for, or potentially NFTs for NFT-based access management. And so at the end of the day, I think what SSI will just be doing, or also NFTs for that matter, is they will just be consolidating all kinds of identity markets, which are currently tackled by different companies that use different technologies to solve these problems, from KYC, KYB, background checks, whatever it may be, digital signatures and so on. On the NFT side, also with ticketing, customer loyalty platforms and whatnot, but also unlock new use cases where identity information or assets are not yet tokenized, or where people have not yet thought about what they can do with it. If they would had SSI or NFTs. And so obviously right now you can already look at these markets and say, okay, well, quite likely KYC, at least in Europe, pretty soon niche will be done based on these EIDAS2 EUID wallets. And so this is like you actually wallet-based KYC that's regulated within the EIDAS2 and the new AMLR, and that's just the way it will work. And if you can use it for AML regulated use cases, you can use it everywhere. And so obviously customer onboarding, right? No forms and these kinds of things. I mean, that's obvious. And then going beyond this, identity proofing of individuals and organizations. All of these things are clear, but then I think there's also this huge value that can be unlocked by just bringing trustworthy or verifiable identity information to use cases where it has never been possible to prove certain information about you before. And this has to do everything with, I don't know, peer-to-peer transactions that are happening. Then I think the potential for SSI and NFTs is just gigantic. And we don't know most of the use cases that are happening, which is one of the reasons why we're building our stuff open source. Obviously, we could do it closed source, like most people do it, and that's completely fine. And there's definitely a market for this and a lot of value in it. But at the end of the day, we believe that there are so many use cases with SSI and with NFTs that we're not thinking about that will be only enabled if you make this available for everyone, so they can just build their stuff. And this is, I think, quite exciting.
Yeah, it's almost like until you don't know what you don't know, especially like in a decentralized aspect, how things get combined together and used together, and just the composability aspect of all of this is extremely exciting. And just it's like the analogy, like you never would have thought about a car or a skateboard or a motorcycle before roads were there. And then who knows what that road is going to be. And when that happens, then it's like, oh my God, there's all these possibilities that we never would have thought of previously.
Exactly.
One of the biggest, I guess, hype terms that I see in cybersecurity and access management is the whole concept of zero trust. How does what you're building and all of this digital identity and NFT based identity, which by the way, the question of what is identity is a very complicated one, because earlier in the conversation, you differentiated SSI and NFTs. Of SSI is more of who I am, and NFTs is what I own. but a lot of
Yeah.
people tie their identities to what I own. So it's
Oh,
it's
yeah.
a complicated
Exactly. If I buy a
topic.
Ferrari, that says something about me, right? So
Yeah, and a lot of people live their lives that way of
yeah,
they want to
exactly.
exactly. But basically, everyone that has a Ferrari, that's their identity. But how does all of this fit in with the concept of zero trust? Like, does it enable zero trust? Does it fit in within zero trust principles? Is it just a hype thing that we're talking about too much? How do you look at that?
Well, it's a good question, and I feel like there's different ways of answering this depending on the level with which you look at it. So what do I mean by this? If you look at the macro level, then obviously identity can never be zero trust in the sense that, issuers always will have to require certain trust by verifiers, or let's say at least for the identity credentials that they issue for respective use cases in which they are used. Otherwise, there would be no value to them, right? So in that sense, SSI itself, it cannot be a zero trust system in the sense that you would not have to trust anyone. But then again, if we zoom in a bit more, obviously there's lots of zero trust components to it, in the sense that one example is, let's say, the way you can build wallets and organize data storage. So as you know, there's different types of wallet. There's custodial and non-custodial wallets. Non-custodial means you control the keys. Custodial means someone else controls the keys. But then you could have setups by which, let's say, you have certain information on the wallet that you use to encrypt the information and then store it in a distributed fashion somewhere else, like a zero trust data store, right? Which gives you some kind of hybrid wallet. And then obviously you can build zero trust systems in there, in the sense that, okay, well, someone could be hosting certain information of mine, like certain keys or identity information. But since it's encrypted, I don't have to trust them not exploiting me, because data is chunked and encrypted and they couldn't do anything with it anyways. So there's definitely room for certain zero trust solutions. To the point you were making, or the questions you were asking about, I hope I understood that correctly. Getting access to resources only if you show certain information. I'd be curious as to how you would draw the connection to zero trust systems in that sense, like how you meant this.
What I was thinking about in an access management context is that the way that a lot of privileged access management systems are set up leads to fraud happening, or like if someone gains access to the credentials of someone with privileged access, they're able to basically do whatever, and that's how a lot of breaches happen. I see. And so it's interesting to think about, well, like by removing, and you don't need SSI to do this, as you've described through stuff like WebAuth, like you don't necessarily need SSI to remove username and password, but it could get interesting to upgrade the level of access requests that are happening at different layers based on credentials, because at that point you could have higher assurance credentials or certain things that you need to present. So always trying to tie those two together to see how they fit in together. So we talked about some of the initiatives happening in Europe, like I guess call it that layer one blockchain layer through EPSI, and the framework on the second layer through ESIF. There are other interesting things that are happening in the European landscape, like the EU's new cloud infrastructure. Be interesting to hear a little bit about that one, especially for a lot of the listeners of this podcast that are based in North America, or at least not in Europe. It's actually people everywhere listening, so shout out to all you people. Thank you for listening. But what could you talk about this new EU's cloud infrastructure, and where does it fit or not fit into this SSI NFT identity architecture?
So that is indeed a very, very good question. So what can I tell you about Gaia X? To be honest, we were always deeply involved in EPSI and ESIF, but with Gaia X, that's just a topic that grew big over the last couple of months, and we were, especially early on, quite at the center of everything that was happening there, simply because we are, as far as we're aware, we're the only solution that's EPSI compliant and published under an open source license. So it's simply the only open source identity wallet that you can have. And so with Gaia X, as far as I understand, the whole idea is to ensure that we can do identity and access management with novel types of systems and not necessarily with legacy systems. And that brought onto the table SSI. And then, what would you use? Okay, let's go for an open source stack or infrastructure that's already compliant with other SSI stuff that's happening in Europe. Beyond this, to be very honest, I don't have that many details about it. There's, however, great companies that know a lot about it and that we work closely on with this, like Delta DAO. And I think, more and more information is being published. I also know that the CTO of Gaia X is very interested in that topic and is really pushing it. And there are always hackathons that you can, just participate in and build stuff with. So we've seen our solution being used to implement all kinds of use cases, from getting something like a Gaia X credential that would allow you certain access rights after you go through an onboarding process, to COVID credentials, education credentials, whatever it may be. So there's lots of stuff being experimented with. But I think here again, it's also quite early. But definitely, there are working groups also working on identity, and they are all aware of the global standards, and they are aware of what's happening in Europe with EPSI and ESIF. And so in the mid to long term, I definitely see, convergence here, because it also would not make too much sense to, do completely different things for blockchain cloud infrastructure. But yeah, I think it's, as I said, it's definitely early, but I guess it looks quite good in terms of how the plans for SSI.
My understanding of a lot of these initiatives was that there was definitely a call by European nation states for sovereignty over digital footprints, and having less reliance on big tech, basically, for digital footprints brings you more sovereignty as a nation state, and downstream could bring more sovereignty to the citizens of these nation states. But if we're just talking about like this from a storage standpoint, I think that is one area that is a very difficult area in digital identity, and I'm sure this happens to you as well, but it happens quite frequently to me in any initial conversation with, and it could be with someone that has a limited understanding of decentralized identity. But when we start explaining, the first question that always comes up is, what if I lose my phone? Or what if I lose my wallet? What happens? It's an interesting question, because it seems like it's a question that needs to be properly answered and properly figured out. What problems need solving when it comes to storage in the context of digital ID?
No, that's a big one, and a very important one. So how do we treat data replication and backups, and how much control or sovereignty should people have versus ease of use? But we briefly talked about difference between custodial and non-custodial wallets. So basically, if you have a non-custodial wallet, if you lose your phone or drop it into the toilet, or if it just, as in my case, just you see the black screen and then everything is gone and no one can do anything about it, then you have a problem if you just have a non-custodial wallet. Because, the key was on there, and then, you don't have the phone, so the key's gone. So to be honest, what I believe is one of the strongest arguments for the adoption of custodial wallets. So basically the idea that someone else is hosting private keys for you. So obviously that's conflicting with this idea of having sovereignty over your data. But on the other hand, one argument is quite pragmatic. Well, most people maybe they should not control their private keys by themselves. Maybe it's good if someone else, if they have a custodian. So if they lose their phone, if it's stolen, if something happens to it, you can just recover that key and or credentials or whatever it may be. Then another point is, at the end of the day, you can just have, very simple and very secure key storage and data replication and backups. So if something happens, it's not that big of a deal. I think many people are fine. And I also think that there are ways around this a little bit, in the sense that I briefly talked about the zero trust data storage solution before. So you can even build those solutions in a way where certain information can be, and certain keys could be custodial, but you could still have certain, processes running client side, so that data could be encrypted and chunked and so on, which gives you kind of hybrid wallet approaches, which you could also reuse. But at the end of the day, I think even more, and that's also again a pragmatic view, more important than the sovereignty question is the question of data portability. And I think those two issues are often, put together. So what do I mean by data portability? Even if I have information custodial with a certain provider, if I can the next day, if I'm not satisfied or for whatever reason, say I want to switch the provider and just, basically take the keys and the information and whatnot and move to someone else, I think it's fair to say that you still have control over that information, even though you may not have full sovereignty, in a sense that, the private key is maybe held in custody by someone else most of the time. So yeah, I mean, I'm not a maximalist for either way. So I think there will be market for non-custodial wallets. There will be market for custodial wallets. There will be a market for hybrid things, because you also need to think about offline functionality, even if you have custodial wallets. So at the end of the day, I think it's really just about which use cases are you talking about, which target groups are you talking about, or user groups are you talking about, and then it makes sense to have all of those and just see basically where the market adopts it.
I think just the question of what do I want to control? Like I want to control how my data is being shared and managed, but do I want to control the storage and the management of all of this stuff? Not necessarily.
Exactly. Should it be about we could differentiate between private keys and then actual identity information, and then we could even pull out this whole idea of just basically the provision of the consent, because you can have a wallet where everything's somewhere in the cloud and you're just always in the middle of every interaction, because it's always just asks you, is it okay to display this? And so I think obviously, the private keys are at the very heart of everything, because the private keys are the most important thing, because you control everything via the private keys. You would definitely have this broad range of where something could be stored and the different advantages and disadvantages that come with it.
Yeah, we often talk about that what we're working on really allows, and we often look at it from an organizational perspective, that it allows organizations to think about what they want to control and what they don't want to control. And this new architecture allows them to move from a network or application-centric architecture towards a data-centric architecture where you don't need to have all the data. But I think at times maybe we don't think about that aspect from the side of the person or the consumer or the citizen as well. It's the same thing. In a data-centric model, doesn't mean that you need to store everything all the time either, right? It's just deciding what is important for you versus what is less important, and maybe brings more advantages and usability and better user experience and stuff like that. But it's just doesn't necessarily mean in a data-centric model that all of the data needs to be completely owned and managed by the individual who owns in reality that data.
That's right. Just like, I don't know, I don't have my money at my home, apart from the fact that I don't have cash at all. Like, I also trust my whole money with, and trust banks with my money, and crypto exchanges and all these kinds of things. So I think it's fine to use custodial services.
Yeah, well, although your crypto exchange comment that would make me scared a bit.
Well, you don't
Nowadays.
need to have it there all the time. And also different exchanges, I think, have different rules in place. What happens if they go bankrupt? So
Yeah, it's a crazy time in the crypto world today.
yeah.
And so one of the kits that you've developed is this storage kit as well. So does it serve the purpose of both storage related to SSI kit stuff as well as the NFT kit stuff? Is it more of a horizontal across these things?
So it's initially, so what it is it's an implementation of the confidential storage spec by diff, or encrypted data vaults is also a word or a term that's been used in the past. So it comes from the SSI space. And we also build it because the wallet kit, it enables this custodial cloud wallet setup. So the server side wallet. And then the way we are building our solutions is for them to be as open as possible. So the idea is that even though there are certain ways of storing data that come with our infrastructure and our libraries by default, you could just plug into, I don't know, Microsoft Asia HSM, or other types of key storage solutions. So we abstracted key storage, we abstracted data storage, so that people can basically store their keys and data and secrets wherever they want to. And then the storage kit is just another alternative for our users to store information in a way that we say, okay, well, it's on the one hand a zero trust data storage solution that allows you to encrypt data at rest and in transit, to chunk it if it goes over a certain size, to have it replicated and back up. And on the other hand, if you store this data somewhere in the cloud, what you could also do is you could use that solution for access management to this information. So something we talked about before, circumventing more traditional ways of exchanging identity information between holder and verifier, for example, by which you can have programmable access rights and CKPs and selective disclosure. So I think it's quite exciting. I think here also it's early on, but it's, I think, an interesting way of thinking about it. And I think, again, here, going back to, do we want to have all data being custodial or non-custodial? There's just many benefits in having your information being stored somewhere in the cloud, and being able to give people access to information or certain parts of that. It just gives you flexibility and also certain operational advantages that you would not have if all your information is on your phone, right?
And it brings us back to the comment that nothing is black or white. Like
exactly,
really,
nothing is exactly.
Hey, we came all the way around.
Thing we said, yeah, exactly.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.